but digital signal processing, which was my
Nice.
least favorite class in grad school, was probably the most beneficial class I had as in grad school.
So I do want to dig into that though. So
Yeah, yeah,
you
absolutely.
got the master's, you did your research. You answered almost all my questions in the school section, but I do have one I'll I'll pull out. So
Sure.
how much of whenever you did your first role coming out, how much of the stuff you were doing was stuff that you learned in your master's, and how much of that stuff was more things that you still had to learn on the job, even though you had the master's and the specialty and the research experience?
It's a good question. And I would say also, like, how much engineering do you actually use from schools? Because I would say that, like, maybe 60%, 70% isn't used. Like, you're like, oh, I
Hmm.
know these equations, I know this stuff. And it's not that you're not going to write out those equations. If you're designing, you're running tests, like there are certain people that do, but especially with computers now, like you
Yeah.
don't need to have like to know everything. But
Hmm.
what you do need to have is an understanding of what is affecting what. Like, oh, I might not remember that equation, but I remember that there is an equation. And I
Yeah.
remember that I can go look that up and go, okay, this is how this affects it. So the first job I had out of my master's, which was a real job because the first job I had was a contract engineering job that lasted like 3 months. Um, and I took it purely because I needed a job, and I was like, I'm going to keep looking.
Yeah.
It was up in Rockford, Illinois, which at that point in time was like the ninth or 10th worst city in the United States, the former
Oh,
screw capital of the world. Yes, it
really?
was. It
They're
was.
not going to
Yeah,
sponsor the
it was.
podcast after you say stuff like that about them.
Oh, it was. I would say that was what the ranking was. I thought Rockford was absolutely lovely.
Thank you.
It had a bad rap. Um, but no. So the first like real job I had out of it was Nissan, and the vibration stuff I applied right away from
Hmm.
between research and grad school, like the maybe not like the shell theory of how to like calculate the vibration of a shell, but
Hmm.
like the signal processing and the modal analysis and the hands-on stuff immediately made sense.
Yeah.
But what I didn't know was cars, because even though I worked at Nissan for 4 to 5 years, I was not a car guy. Like I was surrounded by
No.
car guys who were like, "Oh, like look at this thing, and this engine, and and like, yeah, yeah." Um, I could feel the vibration in the steering wheel. Like, um, so like I could, I had to learn, like what tests they did,
Yeah.
what they were looking for, some of the things that were, you know, particular to Nissan, metrics that they had developed.
Hmm.
And then also, like with most things, when it comes to vibration, it's very specific to that particular thing. So, like if you have a V8, an eight-cylinder car versus a four-cylinder, you're going to get a different response. So,
Hmm.
like knowing what questions to ask, what am I looking for? Is it does it have gears that it's shifting between, or is it a variable transmission? You know, um, so those things were things I had to learn, but they were very specific to whatever problem I was working on, so I
Yeah.
could ask those questions, and I had no problems asking questions. And I think it's very important to be able to ask questions and be okay looking like an idiot. Not like an
Yeah.
idiot, but just like you're like, I don't know. I'm genuinely coming in. I don't know what this thing is, but I know this other stuff.
Yeah.
So can you help me fill in my knowledge where my knowledge gap is?
Yeah.
Um,
So it got you close.
but no,
It got you
it,
close.
get me really close. But I will say that like the most effective class I had, besides the research did a lot because it was hands on. Like the stuff so I went from hands on research to hands on real world testing. So like it was directly applicable. But digital signal processing which was my
Nice.
least favorite class in grad school, was probably the most beneficial class I had as in grad school, um, which
Yeah,
is
because
really
you gotta get
frustrating.
your you gotta get your test input, you gotta get your test outputs and collect them somehow, right?
Oh yeah, no, like it was. It's not just that. It's like how you're processing and kind of understanding like what the because like that's I don't know. Oh, well, you might not know this, but
I
most
don't.
engineering software um, is so unbelievably dated.
Oh
Like
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's like built in like 90 Windows 97 or something like that.
Windows 97, most of them are still like Windows, pull down, menus to pull down menus. You have to look for things. Sometimes like you're running something in like one software call it one thing and another software call it another thing. So like going, okay, I know what an auto power spectrum is. So if you're going to call an SXX or a GXX, I don't care. I know what it is, and that means like if I need it, I can look for it. So a lot of times, from my perspective, um, like the software is really helpful, but because I had the educational background, I knew what I was looking for, right? So like if
Yeah.
somebody didn't know what they were looking for, there's like huge chunks of the software that would just go unused because
Hmm.
they didn't know that there was these things that were capable. So I always make it a big habit of like calling whoever whatever software we're using, like, hey, I have a question. And I just get really buddy with whoever our software person that we're using is, and you're like, hey, like I have a question about this, and I have a question
Yeah.
about that, and they'll send you these seminars and whatnot, and sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes I just like to bug them until they're like, yeah, yeah, and sometimes they're like, we can't do that. That doesn't make any sense. Yeah, like it's a very specific niche that you're asking about, Tyler. Like there's maybe 100 people in the world that would want to do this at all.
Yeah.
So we didn't make a special app for that, but we can show you how we would do it if we did.
Yeah, and I've been giggling this entire time because whenever I had my first like engineering internship, I worked on a software that was on a computer that was from 1997, and it was like it was the slowest machine ever, and they couldn't replace it because they needed it to run that one software, and I just happened to be the person that had to operate that machine and that software. It was the worst
Oh,
thing ever. But so I
it is
sympathize for the people you're
extremely
working
bad.
with. I sympathize with the people you're working with. So generally, it sounds like your master's. I mean, you needed it obviously, and
Right,
it was one of those things where it wasn't everything. You obviously had to learn some stuff on the job, but your
right.
education really prepared you well for your career.
Agree.
Yeah.
I think it did. And just I don't know if you know, but in terms of engineering masters, you have the class only option where you could take, just like you're in grad school, undergrad, you take a bunch of classes, you get credits, and then once you hit like a certain number of credits, you're done.
Hmm.
And then you have the research route. And I went the research route. So like I only had to take
Cool.
like 8 or 9 classes, and then I did a bunch of research. Um, and like the classes were helpful, but the research is what I think really prepared me um, for all the jobs I've had.
Never losing focus because I ain't chasing payments. Still playing in the basement while I'm working on arrangements. They heard the kid in 50 countries, thank God that's amazing. But I'd rather thank Spotify, they put me on the station.